Hey everyone, welcome back to another week of the Bible Overview. We're so glad you have joined us for week 3, where we'll hear from Michael about the time period of Exodus in Egypt. We've loved seeing and hearing from you guys about what God's been teaching you, and we're so excited to get into this next session.
So the previous time period was the period of the patriarchs, in the middle section toward the end of the book of Genesis. And in this period we have God making his covenant with one family, and through that covenant would bring about the redemption of all mankind. So he made this promise to the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob later changed his name to Israel. And that promise was, I will bless you and multiply you and cause your descendants to be great. And through them, I will bless all the families of the earth. And this time period comes to an end, sort of with Joseph in a high position of influence in Egypt, and the entire family of Jacob or Israel moving down to the land of Egypt. And we see they settle there under God's guidance, under God's protection, and they enjoy the abundance and the fruitfulness of Egypt. And that brings us into the period of Egypt. Now, the period of Egypt and the Exodus covers the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And as this time period begins, we see that Joseph becomes the pivoting point between the period of the patriarchs and into the period of Egypt. And as I said, he is in a position of authority and influence in Egypt, where he is essentially the second in charge over the entire country. So he has a lot of authority, a lot of a say on how things are run there. And during this time, we see that the descendants of Israel multiply and increase. And in the first chapter of Exodus, we see the family of Jacob were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became mighty in the nation of Egypt. And so the land was actually filled with the sons and daughters of Israel. Now, after some time in Egypt, this is a period of a few hundred years, we see that a new king comes to power, and this king is not familiar with Joseph or Jacob or the story of the past, and he becomes afraid of the people of Israel. Because there are so many of the Israelites, he thinks that if there is a war, the Israelites might side with their enemies against the Egyptians. And if that would be the case, the Egyptians would have no ability to overcome the Israelites. And so what this king decides to do is to put the Israelites into harsh slave labor. And there's a few ways that happens. They were forced to work with bricks and mortar and building entire cities for the Pharaoh and for the king of Egypt at the time. And we also see they were forced to work in the fields in Egypt, looking after irrigation and the crops. And the scripture says in Exodus chapter 2, the more they were oppressed by the king of Egypt, the more they cried out to God for intervention. Another thing that the king of Egypt did at that time was he spoke to the midwives and commanded the midwives that were working with the Israelites, if there is a male Israelite child born, you're to put that child to death. And that was another way that the Pharaoh oppressed Israel. So we see at this time from Exodus chapter 2 that the Lord remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he heard the cry of Israel in their oppression. And after 350 years of this period in Egypt, God sends Moses, born into these oppressive conditions, and he would become the savior for Israel. Now, he was born into an environment where he had a death warrant out against him. Being a helpless male child from Israel, there was an execution order placed against him. Now, Moses at that time, he was saved by some smart thinking from his family members, and he was actually raised as one of the children of Egypt. he was discovered by one of the daughters of Pharaoh at that time and raised as her child. And so through that, we see that Moses receives this incredible education into the ways of Egypt, although he himself was an Israelite. So he's raised potentially in the palace for 40 years, receiving this education and essentially learning everything that he would need to know to run the country one day. So those are things like warfare and military strategy, things about politics, things about education and economics, foreign relations and diplomacy, understanding of Egypt's religious system and their traditions for worship, as well as healthcare, and essentially everything that he would need to know to one day run a nation. So he spent 40 years receiving this education in Egypt. In Exodus chapter 2, we see that there is a time where he went out from the palace and looked out at his brethren, which this is specified as the Hebrews. So he has some knowledge of his Hebrew upbringing and background. And what he sees is an Egyptian slave master beating up a Hebrew worker. And Moses takes this upon himself, and he strikes down and actually kills the Egyptian taskmaster. Now, he tried to cover this up by burying the body in the sand, but that didn't work out. And when it was exposed that he'd killed this Egyptian, Pharaoh wished to put Moses to death for that. And what that meant was that Moses was no longer able to stay in Egypt, and because of the fear that he had for his life, he left Egypt and fled to the land of Midian. Now, to give you some understanding of how far that is, that's about 400 kilometers or 250 miles. So he ran away from Egypt, from the palace, from his life and from his upbringing, his education, potentially his hope and future as a leader of the nation. And he fled for his life from Pharaoh. And Pharaoh at that time is the most powerful person in Egypt, and Egypt at that time is the most powerful military might in the world. So we see he's got some running to do, and run he does. He eventually finds his way to Midian, which is, as I said, 400 kilometers away, 250 miles. And there he settles down. He marries, and his father-in-law is a priest there in Midian. And he spends his life now as a shepherd in the desert in Midian, in the wilderness, looking after sheep. And what that means is he needs to find a place for them to have food. He needs to find a place for them to have water. He needs to keep the sheep safe from predators in the area. He would also become familiar with the people and the culture in that place as well. And from his father, he would understand what is the role of a priest. And that will become important later in the story. And during this period of 40 years in Midian as a shepherd, I think that Moses is constantly looking over his shoulder to see if Pharaoh or someone from Egypt is going to come and put him to death. So I think a lot of his heart motivation at that time is fear of running away from what he's done. Now that's my own personal interpretation on that. So Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness of Midian, learning how to be a shepherd. In Exodus chapter 3, we have this incredible encounter between God and Moses. And this is a pretty influential time in Moses' life. And this is at the encounter of the burning bush. So here, God reveals himself to Moses in the most incredible way. He says, "I am the God of your father. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Now let's remember that the covenant to Abraham at this point we looked at in Genesis 12 This is about 500 years earlier. And so God is associating Moses with something much more significant than himself. But God doesn't reveal himself just as the God of Abraham. He reveals himself as the God of the generations. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then 400 years or so later, the God of his father, and it brings a personal revelation also to who this God is. And I think that's deeply, deeply impacting. So as God speaks to Moses at the encounter of the burning bush, he speaks a deep sense of identity and significance, both to Moses and also to the people of Israel. And in this encounter, God says, I have heard the oppression of my people. I have heard their cry for help. And I choose you, Moses, to be the savior of my people, Israel. So not only does he speak a deep sense of personal significance to Moses, he also reaffirms his commitment and his covenant to the people of Israel. And through the long period of preparation in Moses' life, with the 40 years in the palace learning to rule and the 40 years in the desert learning to shepherd, he actually calls Moses to this incredibly significant task of releasing God's people from the captivity that they were experiencing. And this all happens in Exodus chapter 3. So God identifies Israel again as his own people, which carries significance and identity for them as a nation. Now let's remember they've been in Egypt for this point of time. This is over 420 years. This is a long, long period they've been there. So they may have lost some of their own national identity, their own history, their own significance under the oppressive weight of Egypt. So God now speaks into that and says, I choose you to go and deliver my people from their captivity. And we see a continued revelation of God's faithfulness to Israel and to his people all the way through this Exodus account. So after this encounter at the burning bush, Moses actually goes to confront Pharaoh and demands that he would let the people of Israel go from Egypt. Because of the incredible economic boost that the Israelites were bringing through their slavery and through the work in the fields and through the construction of cities, Pharaoh obviously is not willing to do that. So God warns and God brings an act of judgment. And this is where we see the plagues against Egypt. There are several warnings and several plagues that follow. All of this, God demonstrates his sovereignty, his power and his might over the most powerful nation on the earth at the time, which is Egypt, as well as over the gods that they worshipped. So through this process of the Exodus, through the signs and the wonders and the miracles that happened, God delivered his people out of captivity in Egypt and brought them into the wilderness. We see time and time again, he demonstrates his compassion for the people of Israel. We see he demonstrates his faithfulness towards the covenant that he'd made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we also see him demonstrate his sovereignty over anything that would try and get in his way. Now, we come to Exodus chapter 19, which is one of my favorite in the whole Bible, which is where God reveals himself and makes a covenant with the people of Israel. And this covenant, this promise that God gives them is conditional, meaning if Israel acts a particular way, then God will bring fruitfulness and fullness and blessing, and he'll be true to the covenant. But if they don't act that way, then they will receive curses and a whole bunch of really bad things, which they want to avoid. And we see this encounter taking place in Exodus chapter 19. So essentially, God says, you saw what I did to bring you out of Egypt. If you obey my voice and my commandments, you will be my possession and you will be my people. And you will be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So God explains his intention for the community of Israel very, very clearly there. That's in Exodus chapter 19. Now, Moses' father-in-law was a priest in Midian, so Moses would have been very familiar with what God was saying here. And the job of a priest at that time was to represent God to people and also people to God. So the priest would hear God's instructions and pass it on to the people, and he would also pray and intercede on behalf of the people, and crying out to God that he would have mercy or he would show favor to them. And that was the role of a priest. Now, we don't just see God wanting to have one priest in the nation of Israel. He wants the entire nation to act as a priest to the surrounding nations and to all the people of the earth. And this is a reminder of God's covenant to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that through their children, through their descendants, he would bless and multiply, and they would reach all of the people of the earth through that, and that redemption would come through that family. Now God's instructions for them to be a kingdom of priests would be to bring redemption to all of the surrounding nations through the nation of Israel and through the family of Israel. He also explains that his intention for them is to be holy. And this word holy becomes very, very important for the people of Israel. Essentially, it means morally, ceremonially pure and clean, without fault or blemish. And that is a direct contrast to some of the surrounding nations. And the way that those nations worshipped their gods were through things like prostitution and sacrifice of human life, including children. And there was a whole bunch of detestable sexual acts and impure stuff that they would do in the worship of their gods. So God is saying to Israel, I don't want you to be like any of them. I want you to be morally and ceremonially clean. And so God reveals his intentions for all people to be clean before him through the covenant to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and now to Moses and Israel in Exodus 19. And this brings a deep, deep sense of purpose to that nation. If they would choose to obey that, God's blessing and abundance would come. So, if they choose to be obedient to God's voice and to his ways, he would take them as his own possession. They would be his people, and they would represent his purpose and his design to the surrounding nations, and that redemption would come through them. At some point through the journey, God leads the people towards the place we call the Promised Land, which is Canaan. And God had promised this land to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob, that this would be the place where they would dwell. So Israel decides it's a great idea to send some spies to look through the land to see if they have the strength and the military power to overcome the people living in Canaan. Now, at this time, the army of Israel, very, very inexperienced. They hadn't fought many battles, and so they weren't confident in their ability. So 12 spies were sent into the land of Canaan. 10 brought back a negative report saying, we are not strong enough, we are not able to conquer the land. 2 brought back this positive report saying, yes, there are giants, yes, there are fortified cities, yes, there are chariots, but we believe that God can deliver this land to us. Unfortunately, the 10 were much louder than the 2, and Israel turned their hearts against what God was trying to do. And as a punishment, God made them to wander as a community in the wilderness for 40 years until everyone from that generation had died, except for Joshua and Caleb, who were the men of faith that brought back those positive reports. And we see this sort of unfolding, throughout the book of Numbers. And it was during this time that Moses was shepherding the people, governing and ruling over the people of God, acting as the priest, hearing God and passing it on to the people, and also praying for God's mercy when the people were rebellious and they were grumbling and doing stuff that God didn't want them to do. Moses would cry out and ask for God's intervention as well. But we see during this time, this period of 40 years of wandering in the desert, the people are not in a good place. They keep grumbling and complaining about stuff, and it seems like their hearts are in a pretty bleak spot. This is a couple of million people coming out of Egypt, and essentially this becomes a massive refugee camp. So God has to give them a way to govern, a way to do healthcare, a way to do education, a way to do hygiene and sanitation. All of these things he needs to give to them so that they can be a nation of their own and they can look after themselves in the wilderness. He also gives them the priesthood of the Levites, and he also gives them the system of worship. He gives them the setup for the tabernacle so that even in the wilderness, God can dwell among his people and that his presence can go with them and that he can speak with them and give instructions. And that's kind of how we get the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, that's written around that time. And essentially what God is trying to do during this period of the Exodus is trying to show Israel who he is, and he's also trying to remind them of who they are. So during this period, God gives a number of incredible revelations about his own character and his own nature. And we see in 34th chapter of Exodus this really cool description that God is compassionate and merciful, and he loves to forgive iniquity and sin. But we also see, he punishes sin. He does as well. So we see God's compassion and God's justice happening together in the same description in Exodus 34, 6 and 7. And we also see God reminding Israel of who they are. And he reminds them of the covenants he's made to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and now to Moses and to the people in Exodus 19. This is all stuff that's happening in this time period. And we remember that this covenant that he's making in Exodus 19, that's a conditional covenant. So if they are obedient to his voice and they walk in his ways, then they will go in and take possession of the land, and they'll be fruitful and abundant and prosperous, and really good stuff happens. And they'll go on to be a nation of priests that represents God to the surrounding nations. All of this happens if they're obedient to the covenant. But if they're disobedient, then we see there are curses and consequences associated with that as well. That being that he would remove them from the land, they wouldn't have rain, they would experience hunger and famine, and they would have surrounding nations come and conquer them as well. So essentially what God is doing through this whole time period of Egypt and the Exodus is, firstly, he's showing them who he is, and also he's reminding them of who they are, called to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation that would represent his covenant of redemption to the surrounding nations as well. And that's what's happening through this time period of Egypt and the Exodus.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching the 3rd session of the Bible Overview, where Michael shares with us how God delivers the people of Israel from the nation of Egypt and establishes his covenant with them. They are to be his people who will represent him to the world. Please be sure to check out this week's resources in the highlight. Leave a comment down below letting us know what God has been speaking to you throughout these sessions. And don't forget to check out the application questions for this week to get you deeper into the Word. So be sure to come back next week where we'll hear from Caitlin about how God brings the nation of Israel into the land he had promised to Abraham. And God remains faithful to his covenant even when the people don't.